Hi, I'm creating this video to demo some controls that I've built for NGUI. Now the motivation behind building these controls was to more easily create highly dynamic UIs without having a lot of extra code outside of the controls to manage where the controls are placed depending on different screen sizes or different areas available to those controls or different control sizes as their contents expand or contract. So this is very early in development, and I'm missing some of the nicer inspector features or menus that would help in adding controls to the UI. But I just want to give a brief demo so that I can gauge interest. So the demo I want to build is going to let you mouse over some of these objects, these three objects in the scene, and just tell you what you've been doing with them. So the first control we will look at is this layout label. I'll add it to the already created NGUI UI, put it on the layer, and you'll notice there are three scripts. The first here is just a normal NGUI label, so I'll give it a font. The second script is this layout label. Now this is what allows the label to figure out where it should be placed in its available area. It inherits from a class called layout capable, which many of the controls inherit from, and that is how all of the control layout happens. Then the second script, or the third script here, is bindable, and it allows the control to have a data source so that it can do something called data binding. Now this will allow the control to set values from a backing data store. So this data context here is currently empty, which means that it will be null unless in the UI tree it has a parent with bindable that has a data context set. Then it'll inherit that data context. So let's go ahead and set up a data binding. So a data binding has three parts. First is the binding target. Now this is the script or class that has a field or property that you want the binding to set. So that's going to be our UI label. So I'll just drag that down there. And the path, the target path, is the field or property on that binding target that you want set. So we're going to be setting the text property. Then the source path is a field or property on the data source, which comes from bindable, that has the data you want. So we'll just call this mouse over. Alright, so now we're going to need a data source. I've already created a demo script here that we're going to be using as our data source. So I'll go ahead and lock this and then go back to the layout label and drag it over, and that'll be our data source. Okay, so that is enough to set up some simple data binding. So let's go look at the code for that demo script. The first thing you'll notice here is that I have already implemented iNotify property change. Now this is how the data binding will figure out that the backing data store has changed. So let's write a property that makes use of this. First we'll need a backing store for the property, which will just be a string, and we will call it mouse over. And then we need the property, and we named it mouse over. Now the getter is pretty simple, it just returns that backing store. And the setter will set that backing store, and then call on property change to fire off that event with the name of the property. The last thing we want to do here is make sure that the property change doesn't fire unless the property actually changed. So if mouse over is the value it's getting set to, we're just going to ignore it. Now let's actually set that value. So we're going to get array from the camera through the scene, and the screen point will just be the mouse's position. And we're going to need a hit info. And then we're going to want to do the rate cast. Alright, so if there was a hit, we will set mouse over to the name of the thing that was hit, which we get from the collider. Otherwise, we'll just set it to an empty string. Alright, so we'll go ahead and compile that. Let's go test this. So, hit run. Now, in this upper left corner, we'll expect some text here based on what I've put my mouse over, like cube, sphere, and cylinder. It's exactly what we expect. So what if we wanted a bit more data, like, say, the position of the element that the mouse is over? Well, we would need another label, and put it on the NGUI layer and give it a font, and it will be data binding as well. So we will use the UI label script as the target with the path of text, and then our source path will just be object position. We'll add that later. First, we need to fix a problem with these labels. Since they're both at the UI root, essentially, they each think that they have the entire screen area to lay themselves out into. And so they'll be drawn on top of each other. So to fix that, we're going to use something called a UI stacking panel. So first, we're going to create a game object, an empty game object, and fix its scaling. Now the UI stacking panel will take all its children and position them next to each other, either horizontally or vertically, based on how large they are. So we're going to need to add these to the game object as children, and it uses their position in the hierarchy as their layout order. So I'm going to call this A name and this B position so that they're ordered as I want them to be. And now, let's go add that object position to the code. So, just like mouse over, we're going to use a string and create a backing store and the actual property. And it's going to look very similar. We don't want to set it if it's already the value that's coming in. And then the last thing we need to do is make sure we call property changed so that as the value changes, it updates the UI. And now in here, let's set the object position to the collider's position. And otherwise, just set it to an empty string in the same way. We'll build that, and let's go test it. But before we test it, this doesn't currently, the position doesn't currently have a data source. Now it'll get it from its parent, but its parent doesn't have a data source either. So we're going to add that bindable, and then we're going to give the parent data source that same demo script, which means we can come into the name label and set this back to none. So let's test this out. We can mouse over and see, hey, cube is at negative 4.5. The sphere is at 0, and the cylinder is at 4. Excellent. That is exactly as we would expect. So let's say we want to make that panel stand out a little bit more. The text just kind of floats there. So let's give it a background. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a sprite and use an atlas I've already created. And select this one, and we'll make it sliced. And we need to go back up to our layout and tell it what the background sprite is, so that it doesn't position it like it positions its other children. It uses it as a background. One last thing, let's move it back so it's below things. So if we run this, we'll see that the background's actually taking up the entire screen. Now this is because the stacking panel currently thinks it has the entire screen to lay out in. So to fix that, we're going to align stacking panel to the left and top. Now if we do it, it's not there now, but as we mouse over these things, each one of those has a background. But we kind of want the background to have a little bit of space between the text and the edges. So let's add some padding. Now this is just like Silverlight or HTML, the box model. So we can add a padding of, say, 5 pixels around the entire thing, and that'll make it so that the text is more centered inside that background. Okay, so now let's say we wanted to keep a history of every object that we've put our mouse over. So have a list over here showing the names of every object. To do that, we can use an items control. So I'll just pull this items control over here and put it on the NGUI layer. And it has this items control script. Now, this script has a property called items, and it is just an enumerable, so it could be a list or an array. And what it will do is for every object in that items property, it will create an instance of whatever this item template is and set the data source on that instance to the object from the items list. So let's go ahead and create this item template. So we'll create a prefab and call it history item. And all we really want it to be is a label. So let's bring this label up. Oops, doesn't need to be in there. Put it in NGUI and set the font. And then we're going to want to bind. So just like all the rest, we will bind to the text. And we're going to leave this source path blank because our data source for the items control will be a list of strings. And so if you leave this source path blank, it'll just use the data source as the data for setting this property, the text property here. So let's put that in that history item prefab and delete it, and then set our item template to that history item. Alright, and then we're also going to data bind the items control, the items property on that, to history. Okay, let's go create that history property. So what we're going to use is an observable collection to keep track of this history. Now, an observable collection fires off an event every time an item is added or removed from it, and the items control will watch for that event and update every time it sees that happen. So in our start, we'll just create a new observable collection and make sure everybody knows that it's there. Now, since we're not going to be changing history any other time, I'm just going to put the onProperty change once here. Alright, and then we also need a flag so that we only add items to the observable collection every time, or the first time we put our mouse over them. Oops. And let's add the item. So let's go history.add, mouse over that name. And then if there wasn't a hit, we want to set this to false. Oops. That's a bool, not a void. Alright, let's go test it. So we put our mouse over it, and we start cube, sphere, cylinder, cube, sphere, cylinder. So you can see that we've got our list building up here. Now if we go over it a whole lot, we'll get this really long list, and it's going to go off the end of the screen. That's okay. Alright, now that we can add stuff to our history, let's make it so that we can clear the history. So we're going to do that with a layout button. Go ahead and add that to our UI and put it on the proper layer, give it a name, And then we also need to go in and set up its children, its background, and its text. Okay, so one of the things to notice about this layout button is it has a script here called the command button. This allows us to bind to the action that the button performs when it is clicked. So we use a data binding, add the command button as the target. The target path is called command, and then the source path, we'll call it clear command. Right, let's go set up the code for that. Here in the code, what we'll be using is called a delegate command to bind to that command. And it has two properties, an action called execute, which is just going to be a void function that takes in an object, which will be the button that is pressed, and then a predicate, which is a function that returns a bool called canExecute, and it also takes in the button that was pressed. So we'll go ahead and add a delegate command here called clear command. And let's set up those two functions. Yep. First, the canExecute. And we're just going to return true. We're going to say you can always clear the list. And then execute clear. Let's actually name this canExecute clear. And that's just going to call history.clear. Alright, so let's go set that up. Clear command is a new delegate command. CanExecute is going to be canExecute clear, and execute is going to be execute clear. And then let's notify that it's changed, just to make sure. Build that, come back to our application and run it, and we can see as we add stuff to that list, it gets longer, and then we can click clear, and it'll shrink back down. So that's a brief overview of the controls I've been building to improve upon the experience of building dynamic UIs with NGUI. If there's interest, I can go more into depth and cover the other controls that I haven't covered here. So thanks for watching.